The ER staff at St. Jude Memorial Hospital thought the quiet new nurse was an easy target. She didn't wear designer scrubs. She didn't laugh at their jokes. She didn't spend her breaks gossiping around the nurse's station. Instead, she moved through the emergency department with a calm, almost unsettling focus that immediately drew attention. Unfortunately for her, attention at St. Jude rarely meant kindness. Located in the heart of Chicago, St. Jude Memorial was one of the busiest Level 1 trauma centers in the region. Ambulances arrived every few minutes. Helicopters landed on the rooftop pad at all hours. Patients poured through the doors day and night, and the emergency department had developed a culture where confidence often crossed the line into arrogance. At the center of that culture stood Dr. Thomas Croft. At 32 years old, Croft was the hospital's rising star and chief resident. Wealthy, ambitious, and painfully aware of his own reputation, he carried himself like a man destined for greatness. His tailored scrubs cost more than some nurses earned in a week, and he never missed an opportunity to remind others of his intelligence. Just beneath him sat charge nurse Brenda Carty. Brenda had spent more than 20 years running the ER floor. She controlled schedules, assignments, and unofficially, careers. Nurses who earned her approval enjoyed manageable workloads and favorable shifts. Nurses who didn't quickly found themselves drowning in difficult patients and impossible assignments. Into this environment walked Sarah Jenkins. At 34, Sarah looked different from the other new hires. She wasn't fresh out of nursing school. Her face carried the faint marks of experience, and there was a maturity in her eyes that made it difficult to guess her age. Her dirty blonde hair was pulled into a severe regulation bun. She wore standard-issued hospital scrubs that seemed 2 sizes too large. There were no colorful accessories hanging from her badge, no decorative pins, no personalized stethoscope. The only thing that stood out was a pair of matte black trauma shears clipped neatly into her pocket, and the way she watched everything. Her pale blue eyes constantly scanned the room. Entrances, exits, hallways, hands, people. Nothing escaped her notice. On her first day, Brenda approached with a smile that wasn't really a smile. "Jenkins, right?" she asked while examining the new nurse's badge. "Where did you work before this? Some nursing home? Rural clinic?" Sarah looked up. "Overseas contract work," she replied calmly. Brenda raised an eyebrow. "What kind of contract work?" "Logistics and field stabilization." The answer earned an amused snort. "Well, sweetheart, this is a real trauma center. We do things by the book." She tapped her chest. "My book." Sarah simply nodded. That response annoyed Brenda more than any argument could have. The criticism started immediately. Unlike the other nurses, Sarah showed little interest in hospital politics. She struggled with some aspects of the outdated electronic charting system and often needed extra time documenting patient information. The staff interpreted that as incompetence. What they didn't notice was what she did during every shift. While others chatted around the nurse's station, Sarah quietly memorized supply locations. She learned where every chest tube kit was stored, every trauma cart, every emergency airway kit, every unit of O-negative blood. She treated the hospital like unfamiliar territory that needed to be mapped and understood. Nurse Chloe Henderson quickly became her loudest critic. Young, ambitious, and fiercely loyal to Brenda, Chloe delighted in making Sarah the subject of jokes. One afternoon, she pointed towards Sarah, who was silently cleaning a gurney after a difficult patient encounter. "Look at her," Chloe whispered loudly enough for half the nurse's station to hear. "That patient just spent 10 minutes screaming at her, and she didn't react once. That's creepy." Dr. Croft glanced over. Sarah continued working without acknowledging either of them. Croft laughed. "I asked her for a 10-blade yesterday. She handed it to me without saying a word. So she didn't smile, didn't say, 'Yes, doctor.' Didn't do any of the normal human interaction stuff." Chloe grinned. "I think she's terrified." "I think she's completely out of her depth," Croft replied. They both laughed. Sarah never responded. They mistook her silence for weakness. They mistook her patience for fear. What none of them knew was that Sarah Jenkins had spent 10 years serving as a Special Operations Independent Duty Corpsman attached to elite naval special warfare units. Most of her military record remained classified. The details hidden inside her heavily redacted personnel file would have shocked every person in that room. She had treated catastrophic injuries in active combat zones. She had performed emergency surgical airways in darkness while under enemy fire. She had stabilized wounded operators inside damaged aircraft and makeshift field hospitals thousands of miles from home. She had spent years making life-or-death decisions where hesitation meant body bags. Compared to that, St. Jude's emergency department felt almost peaceful. The angry patients, the screaming family members, the arrogant doctors, the endless drama. To Sarah, it was little more than background noise. Still, she had promised herself something after the explosion that ended her military career. The roadside bomb had shattered part of her knee and permanently altered her future. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but it ended deployments, ended operations, ended the life she had known for over a decade. When she left the military, she wanted only one thing: a normal life. No combat, no helicopters, no gunfire, no attention. She wanted to disappear into civilian medicine and simply do her job, so she tolerated the abuse. When Brenda assigned her 4 consecutive shifts in the psychiatric hold unit, Sarah accepted without complaint. When Chloe deliberately bumped into her at the nurse's station, sending paperwork scattering across the floor, Sarah calmly picked everything up. When doctors spoke down to her, she remained professional. Every insult, every slight, every attempt to provoke her, she absorbed them all with the same unsettling calm. And that calm only made her co-workers dislike her more. Bullies feed on reactions. Sarah gave them none. One evening, Brenda stood in the break room, venting to several nurses. "She thinks she's better than everyone else," she complained. "That's what it is." The others nodded. None of them realized how wrong they were. Sarah didn't think she was better than anyone. She simply knew things they couldn't imagine. And very soon, the entire hospital was about to discover exactly who the quiet nurse really was. "She doesn't talk to anyone," Brenda complained during a late-night break room conversation. "She doesn't join the coffee runs, doesn't laugh at jokes, doesn't even complain when we dump the worst assignments on her." A few nurses nodded in agreement. Brenda crossed her arms. "Tomorrow, I'm putting her in Trauma Bay 1 with Croft. Let's see how her precious field experience holds up when a real emergency comes through those doors." 3 weeks into Sarah Jenkins's probationary period, the atmosphere in the ER had become increasingly hostile. The staff had already decided who she was. Quiet, awkward, probably overwhelmed. Definitely not someone they considered a serious trauma nurse. On a sweltering Friday night in July, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The city seemed to be boiling under the summer heat. Ambulances lined up outside the emergency entrance. Every treatment room was occupied. Hallways overflowed with patients suffering from heat exhaustion, vehicle accidents, overdoses, and gang-related injuries. The emergency department was stretched to its limit. Then the trauma pages sounded. Trauma Bay 1 immediately sprang into action. Incoming severe trauma. A paramedic radioed ahead. Construction accident. Male patient. Critical condition. Doctors and nurses rushed into position. Dr. Thomas Croft stood at the head of the trauma bed, adjusting his gloves with practiced confidence. Brenda prepared for supplies. Chloe organized monitoring equipment. Sarah was assigned the least glamorous position at the foot of the bed. As usual, seconds later, the trauma doors burst open. Paramedics rushed inside, pushing a blood-soaked construction worker. 42-year-old male, the lead medic shouted, fell approximately 3 stories onto a concrete slab. Massive blunt force trauma to the chest. Suspected pelvic fracture. Heart rate 140. Blood pressure 70/40 and dropping. The patient was transferred onto the hospital bed. Immediately the room exploded into controlled chaos. "Let's move," Croft barked. "I need 2 large-bore IVs. Someone call respiratory. Get blood products ready. Fast exam now." The heart monitor screamed alarms. The patient struggled desperately for air. Croft focused on the ultrasound screen. Brenda worked the 4 lines. Chloe fumbled with ECG leads. At the foot of the bed, Sarah silently cut away the workers' ruined clothing. Her trauma shears sliced through thick denim and heavy canvas with ease. As the chest became fully exposed, something caught her attention immediately. Something dangerous. Something everyone else had missed. The left side of the man's chest was rising dramatically with each breath. The right side barely moved. In fact, it seemed to collapse inward during inhalation. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Then she noticed the patient's neck veins. They were swollen, distended, bulging outward beneath the skin. Finally, she saw the most alarming sign of all. The man's trachea had visibly shifted toward the left side of his neck. A chill ran through her. Tension pneumothorax. Air was trapped inside the chest cavity, compressing the lung and crushing the heart. Without immediate intervention, the patient would die. "Doctor," Sarah said firmly. Her voice wasn't loud, yet something about it cut through the noise of the room. Croft glanced up. "He's developing a tension pneumothorax. Tracheal deviation is present. He needs needle decompression immediately." Croft's expression hardened. The correction from a probationary nurse instantly irritated him. "I didn't ask for your diagnosis, Jenkins." He pointed toward the ultrasound. "I'm evaluating the airway first. Brenda, prepare medications." Sarah looked back at the patient. His condition was deteriorating by the second. Then the monitor changed. The rapid rhythm suddenly disappeared. A continuous alarm filled the room. The patient's pulse was gone. "PEA arrest." Chloe shouted. For a split second, panic swept through the bay. Croft froze. Not long, only a few seconds. But in trauma medicine, seconds can mean the difference between life and death. He reached toward the intubation equipment. The wrong priority. Sarah made her decision instantly. She stepped forward. Fast, decisive, certain. Before anyone could react, she reached across the tray and grabbed a large angiocatheter. "Jenkins, what are you doing?" Croft yelled. Sarah ignored him completely. Years of combat medicine had trained her to recognize a simple truth. When someone is dying, ego becomes irrelevant. She located the anatomical landmark without hesitation. Second intercostal space. Right side, midclavicular line. Perfect placement. Then she drove the needle through the chest wall. A sharp thwack echoed through the trauma bay. For heartbeat, nothing happened. Then hisses. Compressed air exploded from the catheter. The sound was unmistakable. Pressure escaped from the trapped chest cavity. The effect was immediate. The patient's chest expanded. Blood flow returned. The heart, no longer being crushed by internal pressure, suddenly recovered. Beep. The monitor flickered. Beep. Another heartbeat. Then a steady rhythm appeared across the screen. The alarm stopped. The patient had a pulse. The entire trauma bay went silent. No one moved. No one spoke. They simply stared. Sarah calmly secured the catheter and stepped away from the bed. Her breathing remained steady. Her expression never changed, as if she had merely completed another routine task. Across the room, Croft stood frozen. For the first time since Sarah Jenkins arrived at St. Jude Memorial Hospital, nobody was laughing at her. And for the first time, everyone in the room realized the quiet nurse might be far more dangerous and far more experienced than any of them had imagined. "Pressure relieved," Sarah said quietly, stepping back from the trauma bed. Her voice remained calm despite the chaos around her. "You can intubate now, doctor." For several seconds, nobody moved. The patient had a pulse. The monitor showed a stable rhythm. Everyone in the room knew exactly what had happened. Sarah had just saved a man's life. But instead of gratitude, a dangerous silence settled over Trauma Bay 1. Dr. Thomas Croft stared at the monitor, then at Sarah. The shock on his face quickly transformed into something much darker. Humiliation, anger, wounded pride. His face turned crimson. "Get out." The words came out low and sharp. Sarah didn't react. Brenda looked between them, still struggling to process what she had witnessed. "Doctor, his vitals are stabilizing," she said cautiously. "I said get out." Croft's roar echoed through the trauma bay. He pointed a trembling, blood-speckled finger toward the doors. "You do not act outside your scope of practice." The entire room froze. "You do not touch a patient without my direct authorization. You are a nurse, Jenkins." not a doctor. His voice rose with every sentence. You had no right to perform that procedure. Sarah simply looked at him. There was no fear in her pale blue eyes. No apology. No hesitation. Nothing. Croft felt something inside him tighten. The look she gave him wasn't defiant. It was worse. It was dismissive. As if his outrage meant absolutely nothing. Leave my trauma bay, he snapped, before I have security remove you. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Sarah gave a single nod. Understood. She turned and walked away. The swinging doors closed behind her. Inside the trauma room, nobody said a word. Everyone knew what had happened, and everyone knew Croft had been wrong, but nobody challenged him. By the end of the shift, the paperwork was already underway. Croft spent nearly an hour writing his incident report. Brenda gladly assisted. Together, they transformed a life-saving intervention into a disciplinary violation. The report described Sarah as reckless, insubordinate, dangerous. According to their version of events, she had ignored medical authority and performed an unauthorized invasive procedure that could have killed the patient. By sunrise, the recommendation for termination was already moving through administrative channels. The following morning, Sarah sat in the office of David Mitchell, Director of Nursing. Mitchell was known throughout the hospital as a man who valued policies more than people. The framed certificates on his wall were perfectly aligned. The polished desk gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Everything about him radiated bureaucracy. He slid the disciplinary report across the desk. This is serious, Sarah. She glanced down at the document. Mitchell folded his hands. Dr. Croft alleges that you disregarded direct orders and performed a procedure without authorization. He alleges that you endangered a patient. Sarah remained perfectly still. The patient had a tension pneumothorax, she said calmly. He entered cardiac arrest. Immediate decompression was required. Mitchell's expression hardened. That wasn't your decision to make. It became my decision when nobody else acted. The room fell silent. Mitchell leaned forward. I don't care what experience you had before working here. His voice sharpened. I don't care what you did overseas. This hospital has protocols. It has chains of command. Dr. Croft is demanding termination. He tapped the report, and frankly, I agree with him. Sarah's expression never changed. Mitchell sighed. Pending final review, you are suspended immediately. His eyes narrowed. You should clear out your locker. Understood, Sarah replied. She stood and left without another word. Minutes later, she walked through the main hallway carrying a small duffel bag. At the central nurses station, Brenda, Chloe, and Croft stood drinking coffee. When Chloe saw the bag, a satisfied smile spread across her face. Brenda pretended not to notice. Croft didn't bother hiding his smug expression. They believed they had won. The strange, silent nurse was gone. The problem had been solved. Sarah continued walking. She pushed through the revolving doors and stepped into the humid Chicago morning. The summer air wrapped around her like a blanket. For the first time all week, she allowed herself a slow breath. Then her phone vibrated. Not her personal phone. Not the cheap device she used every day. The other one. A secure encrypted phone buried deep inside her duffel bag. Sarah stopped walking. Her pulse immediately quickened. The phone hadn't rung in 18 months. She answered. This is Jenkins. A voice spoke. The exhausted civilian nurse disappeared instantly. Her shoulders straightened. Her posture hardened. Every trace of fatigue vanished. The operator inside her awakened. She listened carefully. Where? Another pause. I'm medically retired, Commander, she said quietly. I don't have the clearance anymore. The response on the other end was brief, firm, non-negotiable. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. Then she exhaled. Copy that. Her voice became steady and professional. I'm 5 miles from the extraction point. She looked back at the towering glass hospital behind her. The people inside thought they had just ended her career. They had no idea who they had sent away. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Then she ended the call. Inside St. Jude Memorial Hospital, life returned to normal remarkably fast. Sarah Jenkins was gone, to most of the staff. That meant the problem had been solved. Brenda Carty had already begun redistributing Sarah's shifts among the remaining nurses. Chloe Henderson spent her afternoon gossiping at the medication station, while Dr. Thomas Croft basked in the admiration of a small group of medical students gathered around the nurse's desk. The uncomfortable reminder of his failure had disappeared. At least, that was what he believed. "It's all about staying calm," Croft explained confidently, leaning against the counter with his arms folded. "Anyone can follow a protocol when things are going well. Real trauma medicine is about leadership." The students listened attentively. "You have to control the room," he continued. "The moment people see uncertainty, you've already lost." Brenda nodded approvingly. Croft conveniently omitted the fact that less than 24 hours earlier, he had nearly lost a patient because he ignored a critical diagnosis. In his version of events, he had been the hero. The fired nurse was never mentioned. Then the windows began to vibrate. At first, nobody paid attention. The sound was faint, a distant rhythmic thumping. But within seconds the vibration intensified. Coffee cups rattled across desks. Computer monitors trembled. The floor itself seemed to hum. "What is that?" Chloe asked, looking up from her charting. The sound grew louder. Thump, thump, thump. The overhead lights flickered. Several patients looked nervously toward the windows. Then the entire emergency department shook as a powerful rotor wash slammed across the hospital roof. Brenda jumped. What in God's name is happening? Outside, emerging through the gray Chicago clouds, a military helicopter descended toward the rooftop helipad. It wasn't a standard medical transport. There were no hospital markings, no bright rescue colors. The aircraft was painted in a dark matte finish that seemed to absorb light. The powerful helicopter banked sharply before settling onto the rooftop landing pad. Its rotors continued spinning at full speed. Before the skids even touched concrete, the side door slid open. 4 heavily equipped operators jumped out. Their movements were fast, coordinated, and purposeful. Between them, they carried a blood-soaked stretcher. Within moments, the team disappeared into the rooftop access doors. Down below, the emergency department remained frozen in confusion. Then the elevator alarm sounded. The trauma elevator descended rapidly. The moment the doors opened, chaos erupted. "Clear the hallway." The command exploded through the corridor. Hospital staff instinctively moved aside. 4 operators stormed into the ER, pushing a stretcher at full speed. The atmosphere changed instantly. These weren't ordinary soldiers. These men carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to dangerous situations. Their uniforms were stained with soot and blood. Their faces were grim. Their eyes scanned constantly. Every movement was precise. On the stretcher lay a severely wounded man. The extent of his injuries was obvious even from a distance. Blood soaked the blankets beneath him. Monitors screamed warning alarms. The patient was fading fast. "Trauma Bay 1, move." The tallest operator barked. Nobody argued. Nobody hesitated. The team rolled directly into the bay. Dr. Croft finally recovered enough to step forward, trying desperately to regain control of the situation. He raised his voice. "Excuse me, you can't bring weapons in too." The operator didn't even let him finish. "Do your job, doctor." The words landed like a hammer. Croft blinked. The operator pointed toward the stretcher. Massive blast injury. Lower abdomen and pelvis. Multiple penetrating wounds. Severe blood loss. His voice was calm despite the urgency. "We've already administered blood products during transport." "He's still crashing." Croft looked down and immediately felt his stomach tighten. The injuries were catastrophic. This wasn't a typical civilian trauma. This was the kind of devastating damage usually seen on battlefields. The lower half of the patient's body had suffered tremendous destruction. The amount of blood loss alone was horrifying. For a moment, Croft simply stared. His confidence evaporated. The medical students watching from a hallway suddenly saw a very different man than the one who had been lecturing them only minutes earlier. The monitors continued screaming. Blood pressure dropped further. Heart rate climbed. Time was running out. Croft swallowed. "I need surgery." One of the operators stepped closer. "He doesn't have time for surgery." Croft looked around helplessly. Where's the trauma surgeon? 30 minutes out. The answer hit the room like a punch. 30 minutes might as well have been 3 hours. The wounded operator didn't have that long. The bearded team leader suddenly grabbed the front of Croft's scrub top. Not aggressively, not threateningly, just enough to force eye contact. Fix him. Croft froze. The injury was beyond anything he had personally managed. His hands began to shake. The calm, confident physician who had bragged about leadership earlier was nowhere to be found. The room could see it. The operators could see it. Even Brenda could see it. For the first time all day, genuine fear appeared on Croft's face. The team leader released him. Another operator scanned the room, studying every frightened nurse and doctor. His expression hardened. Then he asked a question that made no sense to anyone present. Where is she? Nobody answered. The operator looked around again, more urgently this time. We need Sarah Jenkins. The entire emergency department fell silent. Brenda's face went pale. Croft's eyes widened. And suddenly everyone realized this emergency might have something to do with the nurse they had fired only hours earlier. Command said she was stationed here. The bearded operator scanned the emergency department. Where is Doc Jenkins? Nobody answered immediately. The question seemed to confuse everyone. Brenda finally stepped forward from behind the supply cart, her confidence suddenly gone. Jenkins, she asked. Sarah Jenkins. The operator's stare locked onto her. Yes, Brenda swallowed. She doesn't work here anymore. The room fell silent. The operator's expression darkened. What do you mean she doesn't work here? We suspended her this morning, Brenda said nervously. Pending termination. There was an incident involving a patient. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the operator slowly turned his head. The fury in his eyes was unmistakable. You suspended her? His voice had become dangerously quiet. You suspended a Special Operations Independent Duty Corpsman? Brenda blinked. The title meant nothing to her. The operator took another step forward. You suspended a combat medic who spent years keeping operators alive in places most people couldn't find on a map. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then he added 4 words that hit the room like a bomb. A Navy Cross recipient. The entire emergency department froze. Even Croft looked stunned. Before anyone could respond, the ambulance bay door slid open. Every head turned. Sarah Jenkins walked inside. For a moment, nobody recognized her. Gone were the oversized hospital scrubs. Gone was the quiet, forgettable appearance. Gone was the woman everyone had underestimated. Instead, a completely different person entered the room. She wore dark tactical pants and combat boots. A lightweight tactical vest covered her black shirt. Medical pouches lined the front of her gear. Trauma shears, emergency equipment, and specialized medical tools were secured with military precision. Her hair was pulled back into a practical braid. An earpiece curled behind one ear. Most striking of all were her eyes. Cold, focused, professional. The exhausted civilian nurse had vanished. This was the person she had been before St. Jude Memorial. Document. Relief flooded the operator's voice. Sarah didn't acknowledge anyone else. Not Croft. Not Brenda. Not Mitchell. She walked directly to the stretcher. Status. The command was immediate. Professional. Sharp. The operator stepped aside. Blast injury. Pelvic trauma. Massive blood loss. Tourniquets applied 40 minutes ago. 2 units of blood administered during transport. Sarah examined the patient. The monitors screamed warnings. Blood pressure continued to fall. Time was running out. His pelvis is shattered. Croft said weakly. We're waiting for surgery. Sarah didn't even look at him. Step away from the table, Thomas. The words were calm, but they carried absolute authority. Croft obeyed without thinking. For the first time since anyone had met him, he looked completely intimidated. Sarah opened one of the medical pouches on her vest. Several staff members stared. The equipment inside wasn't standard emergency room gear. She removed a specialized catheter system. The trauma surgeon hadn't even arrived yet. Chloe looked at the device in confusion. What is that? A Reboa catheter. Sarah's attention never left the patient. The room exchanged blank looks. Most had never seen one used outside advanced military trauma medicine. Sarah pointed. "Chloe, ultrasound machine, arterial line kit." The young nurse reacted instantly. Gone was the mockery. Gone was the attitude. Right away. Within seconds, she returned with the equipment. Sarah began preparing the procedure. "He's bleeding from deep pelvic vessels," she explained while working. "The tourniquets can't control it." She cleaned the insertion site with swift, practiced movements. "We're going to temporarily stop blood flow below the injury." Croft stared. "You can't perform that procedure here." Sarah ignored him. Mitchell suddenly appeared from the hallway. His face was red with anger. "Jenkins," he stormed into the trauma bay. "You are suspended." Nobody reacted. "Do you hear me?" Still nothing. Mitchell pointed toward the entrance. "Security." Two guards hurried forward, then stopped. For operators had turned toward them simultaneously. No weapons were raised. No threats were spoken. But the message was unmistakable. The guards immediately reconsidered their life choices. The bearded operator folded his arms. "The next person who interferes with Doc Jenkins is making a serious mistake." The room became completely silent. Only the monitor alarms remained. Sarah never looked up. Her attention stayed on the patient. Using ultrasound guidance, she accessed the femoral artery. The needle entered smoothly. Guide wire. Catheter. Advance. Everything happened with remarkable speed. Years of experience were visible in every movement. Finally, she reached the proper position. Balloon inflation. She attached the syringe, then pushed. Inside the patient's aorta, the balloon expanded. The effect was immediate. Blood flow below the injury decreased dramatically. The internal bleeding slowed, then stopped. The monitor changed. Heart rate stabilized. Blood pressure climbed. 50/30, 70/40, 90/60, 110/70. The alarms fell silent. The patient was no longer dying. A collective breath escaped the room. Sarah secured the catheter. Only then did she finally straighten up. At that exact moment, the trauma surgeon burst through the doors. He rushed toward the bed, then stopped. His eyes moved from the monitor to the catheter, then to Sarah. His eyebrows shot upward. "Aortic occlusion?" Sarah nodded once. "Temporary stabilization." The surgeon stared at her tactical gear, then at the patient, then back at her. For several seconds, he simply stood there. Finally, a slow smile appeared on his face. "Well," he said quietly, "looks like you just saved me a very difficult operation." "Zone 3 deployment," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Aortic occlusion successful. Hemodynamics stabilized. He's ready for surgery." The trauma surgeon glanced at the monitor one final time. The patient's blood pressure had recovered. His heart rhythm was stable. The catastrophic bleeding that had nearly killed him minutes earlier was under control. The surgeon nodded. "Outstanding work." He looked toward the waiting surgical team. "Let's move." Within seconds, the stretcher was rolling toward the elevators. The operators followed closely behind. As the doors closed, the tension that had gripped the emergency department finally began to ease. What remained was silence. Heavy, uncomfortable. The kind of silence that settles over a room when everyone realizes they have been profoundly wrong. Near the nurse's station, Dr. Thomas Croft stood motionless. His expensive scrubs were stained with sweat. His confidence was gone. Beside him, Brenda and Chloe looked equally shaken. For weeks they had mocked Sarah. They had dismissed her experience. They had treated her like an incompetent outsider. Now they knew the truth, and the truth was humiliating. The sliding doors opened again. A tall naval officer entered the emergency department. His gray hair was neatly trimmed. A decorated dress uniform was visible beneath a tactical jacket. The moment the operators saw him, they straightened instinctively. Authority radiated from him. Commander Hayes surveyed the room. His eyes moved from the blood-covered trauma bay to the surgical team, disappearing into the elevators. Then he walked directly towards Sarah. "Good work, Chief Jenkins." Sarah stood at attention. "Just doing my job, sir." Hayes gave a brief nod. Then he turned toward the hospital leadership. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. His gaze settled on Director Mitchell first, then Brenda, Then Dr. Croft. Disappointment hardened into visible disgust. I reviewed the disciplinary report filed this morning. Nobody spoke. Mitchell adjusted his tie nervously. Croft stared at the floor. Hayes continued. According to this report, Chief Jenkins demonstrated poor judgment, violated protocol, and endangered patient safety. The commander paused. An interesting assessment. His voice remained calm. That somehow made it worse, especially considering she saved a civilian patient's life yesterday and prevented one of my operators from dying today. Nobody challenged him. Nobody could. Hayes took another step forward. Chief Jenkins has spent years providing emergency medical care in environments most healthcare professionals will never experience. His eyes locked onto Croft. She has treated casualties under fire. Another step. She has made life or death decisions in combat zones. Another. And she has repeatedly demonstrated the judgment and skill necessary to keep people alive when seconds matter. Croft looked visibly uncomfortable. Hayes wasn't finished. Yet somehow, this hospital decided she was the problem. The commander shook his head. Remarkable. Mitchell finally found his voice. Commander, we were simply following established protocols. Hayes turned sharply. Your protocols nearly cost a patient his life. The words landed like a hammer. Yesterday, your staff punished competence because it challenged authority. The room remained silent. Hayes pointed toward the trauma bay. And today, that same competence saved one of my men. No one had a response. The commander folded his hands behind his back. The Department of Defense Civilian Transition Partnership assigned Chief Jenkins to this facility. His expression hardened. That partnership is now terminated. A wave of shock moved through the room. Hayes continued. A formal review of this department's leadership and training practices has already been requested. Mitchell's face lost all color. Then Hayes looked directly at Croft. The chief resident visibly swallowed. For several seconds, the commander simply studied him. Finally, he spoke. You had the opportunity to learn from someone exceptional. His voice was quiet. Instead of learning, you chose arrogance. Croft lowered his eyes. Then Hayes turned toward Brenda and Chloe. The nursing profession deserves better role models than bullying and intimidation. Neither woman could meet his gaze. Their silence said everything. Finally, the commander faced Sarah again. The severity vanished from his expression. Chief Jenkins. Sir, gather your gear. A faint smile appeared on his face. The team would like their medic back. For the first time all day, Sarah smiled. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. Understood, sir. She reached up and unclipped her hospital identification badge. The same plain badge that had been mocked from her very first day. The same badge people had used to judge her before ever learning who she was. Sarah looked at it for a moment. Then she placed it gently on the nurse's station counter. No speech, no anger, no revenge, no final insult. She simply turned and walked away. Her operators fell in beside her. Together, they headed toward the exit. The automatic doors opened. Sunlight spilled across the floor. And without looking back, Sarah Jenkins walked out of St. Jude Memorial Hospital. Behind her, the emergency department stood in complete silence. Not because anyone had ordered it, because nobody knew what to say. They had spent weeks judging a person based on appearances. Weeks mistaking humility for weakness. Weeks confusing quiet confidence with incompetence. Only after she was gone did they understand what had been standing beside them all along. Some heroes don't announce themselves. Some don't seek recognition. And some of the most extraordinary people in the room are the ones nobody bothers to notice until the moment they're needed most.